Good morning and welcome to Monday Talmud. We are on page 32a. We're actually starting in a great place. We're starting with a Mishnah, and we'll hopefully get somewhat of the way down the page, although, as always, we're not in it for coverage. We're in it for meaning. This one is going to be interesting. As we noted at the end of last class, we are finishing off in a section in the Talmud that deals with actually what we say on Rosh Hashanah, which it's pretty interesting that you would get to the final 3 pages of a tractate of Talmud, and only then would it tell you what you say at the holiday. The funny thing that I noted last class is that's really common. It's really frequent that the Talmud will spend a lot of time dillying and dallying with all manner of things and only get to but Rabbi, what are the words that we say on this holiday in our prayers at the very, very end? In the first tractate of Talmud, they talk about the first question in the entire Talmud is Mematai Korina Teshema Ba'aravit. What time do we recite the Shema? Meaning when is the earliest time and when is the latest time that one may be permitted to recite the evening Shema. And only really later in the Tractate of Brachot do they get into what do we say in our morning prayers, right? Which is such an odd ordering of things. And one of the things that we should always remember about Talmud is sequence is fairly irrelevant. There's a famous line in the Torah you should all know by now, but it bears repeating if you have forgotten it. Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. There is no forward and backward, earlier and later in the Torah. The reason for that is it's an idea that Rashi brings from the Talmud, and the reason for that he brings that is because he has to. There are parts of the Torah which, if read as if it were sequentially ordered, would make no sense. The Talmud is even more so, right? Order does not matter in the Talmud. There are lots of books like modern novels that you read where a really cheap and easy way as an author to keep your audience kind of guessing and really engaged is to misorder everything, right? To have start in the middle of an exciting moment and then be like, how the hell did we get here? And in the middle of the movie, you'll get to the flashback that explains how they got there. And only at the end of the movie is all the tension in the plot resolved, right? Talmud's a little like that, but even more so in that they just keep moving pieces backwards and forwards and repeating pieces and so on and so forth, because the editing of the Talmud is a very complicated issue. Last thing I'll say before I get into Talmud, because I am currently explaining Talmud to Ilanit and Olivia, who are advanced Talmud students who already learned this, Rabbi. We already learned this. Your rabbi explaining this to us. But for the mass audience, it's really valuable if you've never thought about how the Talmud was composed. There are great arguments about why the Talmud is composed the way they are. And I think it's worth explaining that these tend to break down a little bit movementally, but only amongst the super nerds, right? Movementally, the Reform and conservative movements, which are very academic and critically based, would say that the Talmud is composed the way it is because sloppy editing, right? Necessity, a need for layering. And there are critical academic Talmudicians, I don't know if that's a word, who believe that the Talmud is filled with critical mistakes, sloppy editing, strange mistakes that are all unintentional. And that is to a certain degree absolutely factually true in the sense that there are at least 9 different extant versions of the Talmud in manuscript form. No one version of the Talmud is actually complete. When the Vilna Shas was composed in the 1830s and then again edited into the format that we know today, which is in the 1870s, they were using, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 different manuscript sets. Olivia also mentioned censorship as a factor in the process. There was a long period of censorship in which in the different 9 manuscripts, you'll find different phrases used and entire sections completely taken out. Most of the censorship was the rabbis teaching themselves, or the later rabbis changing the words for non-Jews into something that non-Jews didn't quite recognize as such. And then there were also sections of the Talmud that were pejorative to Christians, and so they get redacted and then re-added later on. Olivia says so that they would stop burning it. I don't think that actually worked, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Olivia, a lot of time the Christian censors literally just kind of like showed up at synagogue, and an educated Christian censor, usually an apostate Jew, would go through and say, this is a no-no, we've got to cut this out. And the bishop would say, all right, we'll cut it out. And then, 100 years later, they'd forgot that they'd done that, and they'd burn the Talmud anyways. So good times. So if you ever wondered, like, we're talking in America about banned books again, Talmud is like the OG banned book. The Talmud's been banned and burned and burned and banned over and over again for hundreds of years. So if you like reading salacious, rebellious literature, you're talking to the granddaddy of salacious, rebellious literature. I don't know that it's so salacious, although there's some weird stuff in here. All right, onward. I actually haven't even pulled up the text from today, so we're gonna not share the screen until I actually find it. So give me 1 second. I was deep in the actual Steinsaltz Talmud, doing it in the Hebrew this morning, and I got stuck like no fewer than 3 times this morning by little tricky things that I found a little bit perplexing. And then my daughter decided that they wanted to go to school late this morning, and my wife also wanted to go late, so I had to take not 1 but 2 trips to drop the kids off at school. If you want a little window into my life. All right, with that, we're going to share screen and take a look at our Talmud. All right, I'm going to read the English, and my first window open is Elisheva Yuval of Carmel, Yisrael. Elisheva, you're going to read this in the English for us. Matnitin, Seder Brachot, Omer, Avot, Ugivurot, Kushat Hashem, Uchlal, Malchuyot Imahem, Ve'eno Tokea.
Mishnah. The order of the blessings of the additional prayer on Rosh Hashanah is as follows. One recites the blessing of the patriarchs, the blessing of God's mighty deeds, and the blessing of the sanctification of God's name, all of which are recited all year long. And one includes the blessing of kingship, containing many biblical verses on that theme. With them, that is, the blessing of the sanctification of God's name. And he does not sound the shofar after it.
All right, I'm not going to explain anything because I think that paragraph without the next paragraph is very confusing. You really need the next paragraph to go on. Paula, you're going to read this to us. All right. Kedushat hayom v'tokea, zichron v'tokea, shofarot v'tokea, ve'omer avoda, ve'hoda'a, ubirkat kohanim, divrei Rebbe Yochanan ben Nuri.
Next, one adds a special blessing for the sanctification of the day and sounds the shofar after it, followed by the blessing of the remembrances, which contains many biblical verses addressing that theme, and sounds the shofar after it, and recites the blessing of the shofarot, which includes verses that mention the shofar, and sounds the shofar after it. And he then returns to the regular Amidah prayer and recites blessings of God's service and blessings of thanksgiving and priestly blessing. This statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri.
Excellent. Well said. So a couple things. First, we've listed the parts of the Musaf Amidah for Rosh Hashanah sequentially. And the Talmud is basically throwing out there, the Mishnah, the earlier text of the Talmud, is throwing out there, these are the things that we say, and the order that we say them in, and the parts at which we blow the shofar in them. And so that's really important. We obviously need this to know what are the prayers on this day. The Mishnah is going to do this in an interesting way, which is the Mishnah is basically stating this categorically. The Gemara has no authority to disagree. the Gemara is going to do what the Gemara typically does with statements of fact from the Mishnah, which is ask the question why, right? Which is really interesting to be handed laws in Judaism from an earlier generation that are without explanation, right? It's a very, very kind of like repetitious piece in Judaism of Na'aseh v'nishma, the principle that God gives us law and then we do them and we try and make sense of it and understand it later, right? Judaism's a very odd religion in that our faith and our understanding are secondary to our actions. And the way that the Mishnah and the Gemara are formulated is no exception to this, right? You say the avot, but Rabbi, why do we say the avot? Hush, Bubala, just go and say the avot. And then we rabbis make sense of it later. I'm kind of setting this up because the rest of this parak is really going to be predicated on this interesting idea, which is we say these prayers, including Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot, these three special editions just for Rosh Hashanah. The question is, why? And where do they come from? And what's the basis? And on what authority, right? And I think the on what authority question is really important. What gives these words magical power over those words? Why did the rabbis lay these down as absolute, you have to recite these things without explaining where they come from first? So the later rabbis, the rabbis of the Gemara, also known as the Amoraic rabbis, are the ones stuck with making sense of it all. And they will make sense of it all in the name of the Mishnaic rabbis as if they were kind of channeling them and assuming this is what they were thinking when they did it. All right. That's my little introduction to this. The second thing is it says a thing that's sort of odd, which we'll unpack in a second, which is, and hopefully you kind of tripped over this one, which is, and one includes the blessing of kingship, Malchuyot, right, with them, and he does not sound the shofar after it, right? It would be, I think it's very logical and very clean to say, Malchuyot, we recite the Malchuyot and then we blow the shofar. We recite the Zichronot and we blow the shofar. We recite the shofarot and then we blow the shofar, right? There are three special editions to the Musaf Amidah. We know there are 3 periods of blowing the shofar in those 3 editions. And so that's where we do it. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says we don't. The other thing that you all know who are accustomed to studying Talmud is when you get an explicit statement of a rabbi in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, it is a minority opinion, because an unnamed opinion in the Mishnah is a kind of voted majority opinion, and it stands for all the sages. A minority opinion is either like in a runoff election in for instance a primary. Here in Pennsylvania, our primary is tomorrow. Don't forget to vote. Vote early, vote often. Those of you in Carmiel can get on it. It's possible, like in a primary election, that you could have multiple minority opinions and no authoritative rabbinic opinion, which is actually what we get here. And then it is up to the Talmud to kind of suss out which of the minority opinions is the winner. Much like our Democratic primary tomorrow, in which there are at least 3 people running for District 12 for the congressional election, which we are not going to talk about in this room because I made the mistake of talking about that with a coworker and found out that we are totally on opposite poles on who to vote for. So anyways, all right. Mark, do you have your hand up?
No, sorry.
You're waving a cigar around. The last thing I wanted to say is sometimes Adine Steinsaltz gives us a little bonus material. And this is always, I'm always recognizing my audience. This is one of those pieces that Olivia loves, which is in one of the pericopes on the side of the page. Pericope is your word of the day now. Is one of Steinsaltz's pericopes is called Ishim, people, right? And so he has one here for Yochanan ben Nuri, who's a minor character of the Talmud who appears a few times, and Adin Steinsaltz and his team are going to tell us a little bit about him. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yochanan, and remember it's in Hebrew, so I have to translate on the fly. If I make any mistakes, Israelis, please help me. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri haya mechushvei chachamei beyavne. He was one of the great thinkers of the sages of Yavne. Ach kanireh haya min ha-tzeirim shebahem. He was one of the younger guys in that time, meaning he was a student of Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he would have escaped from the destruction in Jerusalem in 70 and at a young age, and been kind of ordained as a rabbi as a youngster. Varov masa u matno bahalacha hu im Rabbi Akiva u b'nei doro. Most of the give and take, most of the kind of business that he did was in opposition to Rabbi Akiva. So that's an interesting little factoid. They're not chavruta, they're not a matched pair, but they show up in the same stories all the time. And that's a thing you see with Talmudic rabbis all the time, that they tend to roam in packs, right? They had a crew, much like at Beth Shalom, where the same people sit next to the same people every week. So too, the rabbis operated in the same manner. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri haya chai b'Galil hatachton. He lived in Lower Galilee. Ube Ganigar o bebeit Sha'arim. I don't know what Ganigar is. I've never heard of Ganigar.
It's a yeshuv.
It's a place. Ganigar is a place you guys know about. This is why we have our Israelis. You guys are our geographers. I know where Beit Sha'arim is, or I'm sure I've driven through it and bought a falafel there on the way to someplace else. Okay. Gam haya.
Beit Sha'arim is where all the graves are of the where
the rabbis.
Yeah.
Famous rabbis. Then I need to go back. The Gam haya be Kisharim Krovim im Chochamei HaGalil. He had strong connections with the rabbis of the rest of the Galil. Abba Chalafta, Avi Rabbi Yossi v'Acherim. So those are two rabbis he mentions. V'af Talmidav ha-muv hakim hayu kenir'eh mechochmei HaGalil. Some of his excellent students were some of the great students of the Galil. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. So we're name dropping here. This is just straight rabbinic name dropping. He's connected with other well-known rabbis. He's connected with Rabbi Akiva, who's well-known, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, Rabbi Yossi, very, or as we all know him in the Haggadahs in America, Rabbi Jose, right? So this is where your Uncle Marvin can make a joke about bringing beans and tacos to the Seder, yada, yada. But anyways, we're name dropping in here, and that's always a thing that you'll see done. Al Chayav, Hapratihim Yadua, Rak Ma'at, that's a late laugh. Rak Ma'at Me'od. The specifics of his life that are known are very few indeed, I would translate it. Ach Misofer Ki Haya Ani Biyoter. It was told that he was really poor. V'haya mit parnes mileket shichacha upea. And that he provided for himself from 3 of the agricultural gleanings that are mentioned explicitly in the Torah, which are known in Hebrew as leket, shichacha, and peah. Leket is the gleaning. It's where you would go through the barley or the wheat harvest, and you would take anything that the harvesters themselves dropped, right? In fact, according to the Torah, if you have let's say you have a 2-man team or a 2-person team, one person is scything the barley, and the second person is gathering the barley into sheaves and putting them into bundles. If you drop a sheaf of barley in the field as you are bundling it, as you go through the field, you are not permitted to pick it up, because once you drop it, it is for the gleaners, right? And so once the first grain harvest, once you harvest your grain, then there's a second crew of people who are doing leket who are allowed to pick it up. So he is one of them. The other 2 that are mentioned here are shichacha and peah. Shichacha is forgotten. meaning presumably there are sections of the field that you either scythed and left and forgot to go pick up, or you forgot to even scythe it. You're right. You didn't cut the like a part of the middle of the field. Row 37B didn't get reaped, and therefore Ali oxen free. It's free for anybody. The last one is Peah. Peah is probably the most well-known of those agricultural ones. It's the corners of the field, right? And the corners of the fields were explicitly not permitted to be harvested. This is all grain and all vegetables. Orchards, I do not believe, and I don't think vineyards are applied to this thing. So the corners of the field. And there's a dispute Talmudically. I know Peah very well because I've learned it multiple times because it's one of my favorite sections. There's a dispute as to whether the obligation of Peah, d'oraita, it looks like you just leave the corners of your field uncut. D'Rabbanan, according to the rabbis, they seem to imply that you need to cut the corners of your field, stack them neatly, and leave them for the poor. Additionally, one last thing I'll say about Peah is a mitzvah that is she'ein lehem shiur, according to the Talmud. It has no measure, which when we read it in morning prayer implies that, it has no measure, because in the context of the rest of the things we read, it means that it's such a great mitzvah, it's like infinitely valuable. That's not what it means. What I mean when I say ein lehem shiur, that it has no measure, is Peah has no measure, meaning it's unclear according to the Talmud and the Torah whether if I leave literally one stalk at the corner of my field, like the corner flag at a soccer field, standing, I have fulfilled the mitzvah, or whether I need to leave, 100 square feet at each corner of my field. And we don't know whether the corners are rounded, whether they're squared off, or whether they're drawn with kind of a line. It could be anything at all. Marian, I feel like you've been trying to ask something. Go ahead.
There is something about the vineyards as well. I don't remember exactly.
Yes,
but
there are lots of rules about the vineyards, but it's not specifically mentioned here. Yeah,
it
I
is
think. Oh wait, maybe Shichacha includes vineyards. I don't remember. It could be.
There is some place in the Torah that we've read recently where you do leave. Yeah.
Oh. If someone knows better, please tell me. I feel like now I'm having a memory that Shichacha is actually may apply to vineyards. I feel like there's a different word for it though. I think olalot is the mitzvah of the stuff that's left over from a.
No, karmecha is your vineyard.
Right, but that's not the name of the mitzvah. I feel the mitzvah's name is olalot, which is
okay.
I'm not if you grew up Haredi, this like the back of your hand, because they had a mitzvah bee and a Torah bee, and I didn't grow up that way, so I had to pick it all up later. So, but I'm remembering it being called olalot. Anyways, all right, let's finish the thing. There's one little tiny paragraph left, or half a paragraph left. Hachacham Isi ben Yehuda kin'a oto kupat ha-rochlim. The sage Isi ben Yehuda, I don't know what kina oto means in this context. Kina.
Jealous of him?
He was jealous of him. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. But then he called him kupat ha-rochlim. I know a kupa is like a fund, and I don't know what a rochel is.
Merchant.
He was a bank of merchants. Interesting. Al hayuto baki b'kol tchomei haTorah. That he was kind of an expert in all of the Tomchei Torah. V'haya nichshav kasemel shel yirat chet, and he was also known as a symbol of a person who was a hater of sin, right? Okay, yep, that's pretty good. So a little bit about him. Good to know. All right, onward. Let's keep going. We're gonna start to see the objection, right? And by the way, if you're wondering why are we spending so much time in the Mishnah when we kind of flew through it last time, as always in a Talmudic argument, if you know the Mishnah really, really well, if you're really comfortable with it, you'll be better off than if you, like when I was in back when I was a rabbi, back in my day in rabbinical school, we were forced, and this is, I think, fairly common in yeshiva, you were basically expected to memorize the Mishnah and be able to recite it on the spot when you were doing that parak in Gemara, which is why I can go, right? Like there was one parak that like I had a really mean teacher and he drilled me, and so I had that memorized. Right. So party tricks that rabbis can do at cocktail parties that nobody wants them to do. Okay, onward. Mark Elliott Shapiro of Beersheba, you are on for Amar Lo Rabbi Akiva, another celebrity rabbi sighting. Amar Lo Rabbi Akiva, Im Eno Tokea LaMalchuyot Lamahu Mazkir, Ela Omer Avot Ugevurot Ukdushat Hashem, V'cholel Malchuyot Im Kdushat Hayom V'Tokea, Zichronot V'Tokea, Shofarot V'Tokea, V'Omer Avoda V'Hoda'a Ubirkat Kohanim.
Rabbi Akiva said to him, if one does not sound the shofar for the blessing of kingship, why does he mention it? Rather, the order of the blessings is as follows. One recites the blessing of the patriarchs and that of God's mighty deeds and that of the sanctification of God's name. He subsequently includes the blessing of kingship in the blessing of the sanctification of the day and sounds the shofar. Next, he recites the blessing of remembrances and sounds the shofar after it, and the blessing of shofarot and sounds the shofar after it. He then recites the blessing of God's service and the blessing of thanksgiving and the priestly blessing.
Great. Spoiler alert, I think most of us probably know this if we go to Rosh Hashanah every year, but if you didn't, that's okay. Or if your synagogue cuts a lot of this stuff short and you don't know the titles of these sections very well, that's also okay. Spoiler alert, Rabbi Akiva wins, right? We know that because when we say the Rosh Hashanah liturgy every year, this is how we do it. So the interesting thing here is, I'll say one more thing, and then Eleni has her hand up. The interesting thing here is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbi Akiva don't disagree about how many times you blow shofar during the Musaf Amidah. They're all, because it's 3, right? You definitely blow 3. It's just that Yochanan ben Nuri holds you do it at Kedushat Hayom and Zichronot and Shofarot. And Akiva holds that you do it at Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. And then the other piece is Yochanan ben Nuri holds that Kedushat Hayom is appended to the end of Malchuyot, right? Because he says, Kedushat Omer Avot Ugivurot Kedushat Hashem v'cholel Malchuyot imahem, right? You do Malchuyot with them. Do we know what that means? Not really. By the way, additionally, and this is really important, then I'll call on Eleni, do we know what is in, like we know what's in Avot and Givurot and Kedushat Hashem, because we're talking about the thing that all of us say every single day, 3 times a day, 4 times on Shabbat, 5 times on Yom Kippur, which is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, right? And Atah Gibor L'Olam Adonai, right? Depending on your nusach. And Naritzachav and Na'aktisha Kasotziach, like all that, right? That we say all the time. But then it says we do something called Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. We have no idea what that is as of right now, where we're holding right now. They will pull that out in the Gemara. And when they pull it out in the Gemara, they'll say it in such a way like, we all know what we were talking about. We're all on the same page. All right, Eleni, go ahead. You had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, I was just as you were saying, Rabbi Akiva wins, just as I was typing, like, interestingly, neither of these is how we do it today, right? Because what Rabbi Akiva says is that Malchuyot goes with Kedushat Hayom, which is not what we do, right? One of the differences is whether Malchuyot goes with Kedushat Hashem or Kedushat Hayom. But the way we do it now is we do Kedushat Hashem, then Kedushat Hayom, and then we do Malchuyot with Zichron Shofar. We don't include it with Kedushat Hayom now. So it's not exactly the way Rabbi Akiva says it.
Fascinating. I'm gonna there's a longer note here. I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but I'll read up on the part down below that's longer for next time, and hopefully get it for you. I was assuming it is the same because I don't pay that much attention to the liturgy because I'm too busy doing it. So, but it says here, and this is a citation from, it doesn't say where it's cited from. My assumption is that it's from Shulchan Aruch, but it doesn't actually say that. But Musaf shel Rosh Hashanah, Omer, Birkat Avot Givurot, in Rosh Hashanah and Musaf, we say Avot and Givurot, Ubirkat Kedushat Hayom, Kolel, Gam Malchuyot V'Tokea, Omrim Birkat Zichronot V'Tokea, Ubirkat Shofarot V'Tokea, basically what I just said. Here's the part, Eleni, that's interesting, according to Shulchan Aruch, Kedivrei Rabbi Akiva. That is according to Rabbi Akiva. And then he continues. This is Shulchan Aruch is this guy down here. That's Yosef Karo, the 15th and 16th century Kabbalist from Sfat, who codifies all Jewish law and is the final word for everyone, but kind of the conservative movement. Although even in the conservative movement, we hold by like 97 to 98% of what he said, I would say. So he continues, Rabbi, Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Shehalacha Kamotu Mechavero V'ken Nahagu B'Yavne, right? Which is a really interesting statement. Translating that, it says that the law is according to him amongst all of his colleagues, and thus we do in Yavne, which is super interesting, right? So one of the things that the later rabbis do in the codification, right? The big three codifiers are the Rosh, the Rif, and the Tur. And Karo is the one who comes after them to decide which of those three wins in an argument. But those three big guys were the guys who decided who wins in a Talmudic argument. Mostly the Rosh, who's the earliest, is the guy who picks and chooses winners. And so it would have been probably according to the Rosh that we learn that we hold like Akiva when he's going up against his boys, right? Like when Michael Jordan goes against Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan wins all the time, but not because we actually take score of the points, but just because somebody watched the videotape 100 years later and said, oh, Michael Jordan's better than Magic Johnson. That's how it was decided, which is kind of insane. Okay. I hope that answered your question, Eleni, or actually disagreed with you in an uncomfortable way that will make you mad at me for the next week.
No, you're
I'll read the second paragraph next week and we'll figure out why it's not, maybe we'll figure out a little bit why it's not exactly the way the Shulchan Aruch says to do it. It's possible, Eleni, that these are slight changes that the prayer book has made over time for order or for cleanliness. I have prayer books that are kind of avant-garde conservative-ish prayer books where stuff is relocated all over the place inside Musaf, because Musaf is so long, and it's so hard to say like, oh, we're going to keep the service exactly as it's always been, right between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock when everybody is totally cooked and nobody wants to be there anymore, right? Okay, because if you're a conservative congregant, you know there's this massive like influx of people at about 10 o'clock when we get to about Torah service and the shofar blowing, and then we do Yizkor, and then there's this massive exodus, right? All these people just leave. So okay, anyways. Right. Onward. Let's do the Gemara. Marion, you're going to read this for us. Amar Rabbi Akiva, im eno tokel malchuyot, lama hu mazkir. Lama hu mazkir? Rachmana amar adkar. Ela, lama eser. Lema tesha. Dehoil v'ishtani ishtani.
Gemara. The Mishnah taught that Rabbi Akiva said to him, if one does not sound the shofar for the blessing of kingship, why does he mention it? The Gemara expresses surprise at this question. Why does he mention it? The merciful one states that one should mention it. It is a mitzvah to recite the blessing of kingship regardless of the sounding of the shofar. Rather, this is what Rabbi Akiva meant. Why does one mention 10 verses of kingship as in the other blessings? Let him read 9 verses or fewer. Since the blessing is different in that it is not followed by shofar blasts, let it also be different with regard to the number of verses it includes.
Right. Okay. This took up 15 minutes of my time sussing out what the heck is going on here. Because it's, maybe you're all smarter than me, but I found this unbelievably confusing. It is to some degree a standard objection at the beginning of a Mishnah. If you've done enough Talmud with us, if you've been with us for the last 2, 3, 4 years, then some of this might feel familiar if you remember back. At the beginning of most of the Mishnahs, and particularly the Mishnahs at the beginning of each parak in Rosh Hashanah, and this is fairly common throughout the Talmud, but more so even in Rosh Hashanah than other tractates. What we're seeing here is the Talmud states, the Mishnah states X, and the rabbi asks why, why is that the question? Why is that a good question? Shouldn't he have asked a different question? That's the problem that the Gemara is throwing up here, which is basically the question that Rabbi Akiva asks is not the right question. Why is Rabbi Akiva's question not good? The answer is very simple, okay? So Rabbi Akiva says, Lamahu Mazkir, right? Why does he mention it? Why does he mention that there is not a sounding at Malchuyot, right? Why does he mention it? Is a weird question. And the reason is because D'oraita, you mention it. Why do I say D'oraita, you mention it? Because the verse in Leviticus 23:24 says, on the first day of the month, it shall be for you Shabbaton Zichron Trua. It should be a Sabbath to you of remembrance of the blowing. And the word Zichron and the word Mazkir are the same here. Meaning the implication here is it's D'oraita spelled out in the Torah that you blow the shofar for Malchuyot because of Zichron, right? So if the Torah says it explicitly, Rabbi Akiva would never ask, Lamahu Mazkir. Rabbi Akiva knows the Torah backwards and forwards, upwards and downwards. He would never be so improper as to say, why are we saying Mazkir? We're saying Mazkir because the word Zichron appears right in Leviticus. Therefore, this is the important phrase. That can't be Rabbi Akiva's problem, right? So when it says Lamahu Mazkir, the problem that Rabbi Akiva is having is not about the mentioning of Malchuyot. It has to be something else. So our Talmudic rabbis, hopefully you understood that. If you didn't understand that, that's okay. So our Talmudic rabbis are going to say, Rabbi Akiva is not bothered by Malchuyot's appearance here, and the Torah's explicit kind of mentioning of Zichron. Rabbi Akiva thinks that the phrase Lamahu, what he's saying when he says Lamahu Mazkir, what he means is, why are there 10 verses of Malchuyot? And his objection is it should be 9. Since the blessing is different than in that it is not followed by shofar blast, let it also be different in regard to the number of verses it includes. It's a very nerdy, specific objection, but I'll explain it a little bit further. Probably you know this, maybe you don't. Maybe we mentioned it last time, I don't remember. Malchuyot, Zichron, and Shofarot are, by definition, 10 verses from Torah which use the word Melech in the example of Malchuyot, Zichron in the example of Zichronot, and Shofar in the example of Shofarot. right? So Yochanan ben Nuri says, you don't blow shofar at Malchuya. You blow it for Kedushat Hayom instead. So Rabbi Akiva's objection when he says Lama hu maskir, according to the Gemara here, is the problem that he's having is if you're not going to blow shofar at the end of Malchuyot, but rather you're going to do it in Kedushat Hayom, you should only recite 9 verses instead of 10 verses. Okay? Why does Rabbi Akiva think this? Or why does the Gemara put those words into Rabbi Akiva's mouth? I have no idea, but that's their objection, right? That's what they think is going on here. Now, this might just be a fun flight of fancy of the rabbis where they say, Rabbi Akiva is so brilliant, how dare they say that he had a simple problem when it must be actually a complex problem. That's my take, that like the rabbis are often trying to complexify a text, especially in the name of the greatest sages, who they all assume were incredibly brilliant and would have never asked a basic question like Lama hu maskir. Okay, Olivia, go ahead.
Something's interesting to me in how they're saying Rahmana told them to do this.
Yeah.
When they're talking about worshiping God as king, they choose the word for God, which is womb and like nurturing.
It's a great point, Olivia, and it allows me to give, I'm glad you picked up on that in the Hebrew, since most of the people who are doing this mostly only in English may have kind of skipped over the fact that it says Rahmana, the merciful one. It is beautiful to drash the idea of the rabbis calling God Rahmana as a name for God in the Talmud. Nerdy Talmudists, which may include myself, will note that Rahmana is a technical term in the Talmud, typically, and it means that it is derived from Torah, right? So there's some disagreement as to whether when we say Rahmana, we're talking about God or whether we're really talking about the Torah. And as we all know, God speaks through the Torah. So that might be another way of kind of harmonizing those two things. But it's still a lovely thing, like the fact that we call God's divine presence on earth in the Talmud only the Shekhinah, that when God speaks in the Talmud, it's not God, it's always a bat kol, which is another unique name. And Rahmana is another fairly unique name that the Talmud invents for God. So that's, I think, a really notable thing, Olivia, and I'm really glad you called our attention to it this morning.
Do you have a source for Rahmana meaning like Torah?
I do. I bet you it's in the Frank. I have my Frank dictionary. Since the question didn't come up in advance, I wasn't prepared, but I will read to you from the Frank dictionary and about Rahmana and see what it says. If I am wrong, I would say God strike me down, but that would be bad because we're having a little bit of lightning and thunder here in Pittsburgh. So I don't want to tempt the evil eye, but I mean, Olivia, it's always possible that I misremember.
Amazing if that's true.
My daughter was just asking me about this morning, like, why is Abba's memory so bad? And then I was like, because I have all these books behind me. I don't have to remember anything. I just need to know where to find it. All right. It says here in Steinsaltz, very little, but it basically backs me up. Rahmana, Harachaman, HaTorah, the merciful God, semicolon, the Torah. So Frank just says it authoritatively, that when it says Rahmana, it means the Torah. Why does Frank say that? I have no idea. Okay. All right, onward.
All right, I'll do some digging on my own, I think.
It's a great question. Jastro may have a better answer for you than Frank.
Jastro, like, one would expect that they would say, like, the Torah, right? But because they say it's Deoraita all the time.
You're right. Well, you're right in the sense that there are multiple other ways of saying it's in the Torah, right? Kedichtiv is the thing that you see all the time. The Amra Torah, it will say literally, right? And the Torah says, right? So when it says Rahmana, it may be that there's a technical usage there that is different from Kedichtiv. The only difference I can see immediately is here where it says Rahmana, it doesn't actually quote Torah immediately afterwards. Whereas when you say Kedichtiv, it does immediately quote Torah. So it's kind of saying like, but the Torah says it a different way. I don't know. Anyways, all right. Tanu Rabbanan, let's keep going. Noreen, you're next up in the window if it's okay by you. Tanu Rabbanan, Minayin she'omrim avot, shenemar havu ladonai b'nei elim, uminayin she'omrim gevurot, shenemar havu ladonai kavod va'oz, uminayin she'omrim kedusha, shenemar havu ladonai kavod shemo, hishtachavu ladonai bahadrat kodesh.
The sages taught in a Baraita. From where is it derived that one recites the blessings of the patriarchs? As it is stated, ascribe to the Lord, O you sons of the mighty, which is interpreted to mean that one should mention before God the greatness of the mighty, i.e. the righteous patriarchs. And from where is it derived that one recites the blessing of God's mighty deeds? As it is stated, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. And from where is it derived that one recites the blessing of the sanctification of God's name? As it is stated, ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of sanctity. And all of those statements are from Psalms 29, 1 and 2.
Great. So interestingly enough, okay, so what we have here is a Baraita that applies to, and this is, I think, important to note if you didn't already pick it up, every holiday and Shabbat that we have, right? And it is a bit of, again, if you are in the kind of more academic schools of Reform and Conservative Talmud study, and even in the Orthodox world, some schools, you will say, this is an ex post facto rationalization of why we say these three prayers of the Avot and Givurot and Kedushat Hayom, which is that they are hooked by the rabbis to the first three lines in Psalm 29, right? Psalm 29, interestingly, as I learned in my Psalms class with Dr. David Lieber of blessed memory, is probably dated by most scholars as the oldest piece of the Bible existing, along with Shirat Hayam. And it is, you'll look at that first line, and if you haven't heard this from me before, you will now. It is some serious borderline blasphemy, which is that Havu Ladonai B'nei Elim, right? Ascribe to God the sons of the mighty. Now the rabbis here are translating this as God is great. And we're talking, and the B'nai Elim that are being referred to according to the rabbis is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is not what it meant in the Psalms, right? In the Psalms, which this Psalm is believed to have predated even the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, possibly, because it may have been imported from Ugaritic, Babylonian, or Assyrian texts that pre-existed the Bible. According to some scholars, I have to, that's my disclaimer. It's like it's like saying allegedly when you say something in a newspaper article that you're not sure you might get sued about. Allegedly. So B'nai Elim here literally means like gods or sons of gods or demigods, right? And so in ancient Israelite theology, Judaism wasn't monotheistic the way we are monotheistic in the sense that there is one God. It was that Jews are monotheistic. We only have one God, and all these other religions, they are polytheistic, right? The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, they have multiple gods for them, but they ain't our God. Our God is Elohim / Yod He Vav He. That's the one we pray to. So when it says Havu Ladonai B'nai Elim, what it means is Havu. Ascribe is such a weird word, but probably means like, yo, he's cooler than, right? Our God is over the B'nai Elim. Our God is Kavod Va'oz. Our God is Kavod Shemo, right? Like all of those things. So anyways, the rabbis are having rabbi fun time where they're applying Psalm 29 as the basis for why we do all these things. but I think it's really not necessarily the reason why Avot, Givorot, and Kiddush Ad Hayom are hooked up, are written the way they are. I think it's just Rabbi fun time. They're using a verse to prove their point. All right, Marion, and then Mark.
Okay, interesting to note in Parshat Breshit, Genesis, they're written that Bnei Elim came down and took wives from the children of men.
Yeah. So it's possible. I mean, you can't dating biblical texts is like you can get a PhD in it. Any one of us. As long as you disagree with the last PhD article that you read. So when I said this text, is supposedly predating even Genesis, there are certainly scholars who would disagree with that. And Marion, you just made a really good case for why it would probably be parallel and living at the same time as Exodus, which is this story that is problematic, as one of our favorite modern words, right? Problematic is problematic for modern scholars because this idea that demigods came down from heaven and mated with the females and produced offspring. It's really weird for Jews. Like we don't really know what to do with that. So guys like Rashi and Ramban and Ibn Ezra will clean that up by basically saying, oh, the Bnei Elim are not demigods. They're something else. But like biblical scholars would be like, they're demigods. Like this is Elon Eaton me. We only know demigod from having been forced to watch Moana 4,000 times. But like, Maui came down and mated with Moana, and their offspring, went off and mated with Adam and Eve's kids, right? And that's how we get the linebackers for the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're, yeah. I appreciate that you laughed at that not very good joke. All right, Mark, go ahead.
No, and also we have the phrase that we recite in the Amidah prayer, Mi chamocha be'elim Hashem.
Yes.
Which is very strange.
Yeah, it's amazing that we say Ba'elim Adonai. That's right, and that's a basis for why when I said before, you picked it up pretty quick. Shirat Hayam, which is where Michamocha comes from, has that word in it again. And again, this is one of those things where the movements are going to split, right? In Orthodoxy, proclaiming that the Bible included pre-Jewish texts which were polytheistic, or at least acknowledged the existence of polytheism, full-blown heresy, right? And my description of Judaism as monotheistic of its time, but recognizing that other religions had other gods, also full-blown heresy. Not something you would hear if you took this class from an Orthodox rabbi. To some degree, and I'm just going to pat myself on the back here, this is why the conservative movement is awesome, because the Reform movement doesn't have as much Talmud teaching. They don't put it as a core of what they think is the most important part of their religion. And the Orthodox would never teach the biblical, critical, historical perspective of how these texts originated. So, this is a thing that you can only get from the conservative movement. Long may it live. Send in your money to United Synagogue. It's very rare you're going to see me get up on my horse for the conservative movement. And for those of you who are not conservative Jews, I apologize, and I say it only 50% tongue in cheek. So just know that I'm a movement guy, except when I'm not a movement guy. Okay, onward. Let's see, who has not read this morning? Paula, speaking of movement guys, you're going to do verse 7, and we'll see where it goes. We're running out of time, which is good. All of this stuff, this page doesn't really, the rest of this is more or less more of the same. So we can kind of, maybe next week we'll go a little faster. Uminayin shomrim malchu yod zichronot v'shofarot, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, dichtiv, Shabbaton zichron trua mikre kodesh. Okay, Shabbaton ze kedushat hayom. Zichron elu zichronot. Trua elu shofarot. Mikra Kodesh, Kad Shehu Ba'asiyat Malacha.
And from where is it derived that on Rosh Hashanah one recites the blessings of the kingship, remembrances, and shafarot? Rabbi Eliezer says, as it is written, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a solemn rest, a memorial of blasts, a sacred convocation. This verse is interpreted as follows: a solemn rest, this referring to the blessing of the sanctifications of the day, a memorial, this is remembrances, blast, this is shofarot, a sacred convocation, this means sanctify it by abstaining from performing prohibited labor.
All right. So the Torah says in Leviticus 23:24, 4 things. Okay. I'm counting it as 4 things. It says Shabbaton, it says Zichron, it says Truah, and it says Mikra Kodesh. Okay. We saw those 4 things. So here, the Rabbi Eliezer, one of the great Tannaitic sages, kind of continuing the idea from above of where are the lines in the Amidah derived from, where are the ones specifically for Rosh Hashanah derived from, okay? So Shabbaton is the basis for Kedushat Hayom, for the sanctification of the day, right? Which is a blessing we say for each holiday, which mentions why we say the blessing on this holiday, right? For Shabbat, there's a different one in Shacharit and in Musaf, but like Visham Eruv and Yisrael is like one of those like Kedushat Hayom kind of moments that shows up in Amidah. Zichron is Zichronot. Truah is Shofarot, because Truah means blow and Shofar is the thing you blow. And then Mikra Kodesh, strangely enough, is hooked to Kadshehu Ba'asiyat Melacha. We do Mikra Kodesh not by saying a thing in the service. We do Mikra Kodesh by abstaining from prohibited labor. Okay, so you will probably note that that feels a little strange in the sense that the Hebrew literally says Mikra Kodesh, but we don't say Kedushat Hayom from Mikra Kodesh, according to Eliezer. Okay, I'm tipping my hand a little bit and showing you that there's going to be an objection in the next section, because this one's a little weird, right? So we're going to get an objection from Rabbi Akiva. This is, according to the understanding of the Gemara, the basis up above for Rabbi Akiva's whole understanding of the ordering of the prayers and why we say Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofar, and we blow, and we blow, we blow at each of those points. All right, with that, who else we got? Renee, would you do me the honor of reading this morning? Amar lo Rabbi, and then we'll finish on this. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, mipnei ma lo nomar Shabbaton, Shavut, Shabo patach hakatuv techila, ele Shabbaton kadshehu ba'asiyat malacha, Zichron, elu zichronot, Truah, elu shofarot, Mikra Kodesh, zo kedushat hayom. Unmute yourself, Renee. I can't hear you.
Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Eliezer, for what reason isn't it stated instead that the phrase solemn rest teaches that one must rest by abstaining from prohibited labor, as this is the term with which the verse opened first? It stands to reason that the verse would begin with the main issue, that this day is a festival on which performing labor is prohibited. Rather, the verse should be explained as followed: a solemn rest, sanctify it by abstaining from performing prohibited labor. A memorial, this is remembrances. Blasts, this is the shofarot. A sacred convocation, this is the sanctification of the day.
So this is one of those places where the English does you no favors, right? The Hebrew is really the way it goes. Well, all we're trying to do here is the rabbis are trying to line up, why do we say the things that we say according to the way we say them? So remember, the verse says, Shabbaton, Zichron, Truah, Shabbaton, Zichron, Truah, Mikra Kodesh. Those are the words straight up in the line, right? It shall be a Sabbath of remembrances of blasts and a holy convocation. Again, the English does you no help there because it's just a bunch of words. So Rabbi Akiva has the same objection that I do, and that's because his ordering of the verses makes more sense, right? It's neater and cleaner. So let's skip Shabbaton for a second, just because it's simpler this way. Both rabbis agree that zichron refers to zichronot. Both rabbis agree that trura refers to shofarot. They disagree about mikra kodesh and shvut. Rabbi Akiva holds in the simplest, cleanest way that I alluded to above, which is when it says in the verse in Leviticus 23, mikra kodesh, that is, and the word kodesh appears, that is kiddushat hayom, right? The mikra kodesh is the reason why we say kiddushat hayom. The word kodesh appears in both, seems logical to me. Shabbaton, which means from the root of shavut, which means rest, right? I don't know if you've all thought that the word Shabbat doesn't mean Shabbat. It actually means rest. Shvut shabo patach hakatuv techila, right? Solemn rest is what the verse opens with, right? That really the word Shabbaton is about the rest. And the rest of that verse deals with Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot, and Kedushat Hayom. All right, that's all the time we have for today. I'll stick around in overtime and answer any questions anybody has. Also, because there's 16 notes in the chat that I have not generally seen. So with that, we're going to stop the recording. We'll see you next week.